Hey, it's Patrick again, and today I'm diving into the most haunting moments involving live TV hosts. Incidents that were impossible to unsee and change television history forever. From a hammy host's rugby tackle gone absolutely wrong, to an outdoor host catching a concrete fragment with his gut, scarring his audience in the most horrific way possible. It was August 21st, 2014. It started like 100 other segments. Handshake, banter, a playful jog into position. What no one on that field knew, not the host, not the crew, not the coach, was that the next 5 seconds would draw a line between before and after. Marco Conrado Abdurrahman's production team had arranged the live segment with a local private high school in Cebu, Philippines, where varsity players had been running controlled tackling drills for the earlier portion of the shoot. Marco was a regional morning show host with 15 years across radio and television. He was known for showing up at barangay fiestas, school science fairs, amateur boxing gyms, and inserting himself into whatever was happening. He had no athletic background, but had built his identity around appearing game for anything. The rugby segment was his idea. The head coach raised the issue of padding before the cameras rolled, suggesting at minimum a chest protector. A second staff member echoed the concern on camera. Marco declined both, saying the gear would undermine the authenticity of the segment. Personally, I think that decision, on camera in front of students, made it nearly impossible for anyone to push back further. A 17-year-old varsity player was selected and told to reduce his speed, with the coach instructing him to wrap and stop rather than drive through the contact. They said that Marco confirmed he understood the plan. He had done physical segments before. He had taken paintball hits, fallen off a mechanical bull, been dunked in a tank. The framework in his head was probably not wrong. It was just applied to something with a different ceiling. He was not indifferent to risk. He simply had no reference point for what a proper rugby tackle does to an unprepared body. The field sat under a partial overcast by the time the segment began, the light flat and even. 2 handheld camera operators stood at opposite angles. A third camera was fixed on a temporary elevated platform along the sideline. A cluster of students watched from behind the end zone markers. The coach stood near the hash marks with his arms crossed. Marco took his position near midfield, arms half raised, feet shoulder-width apart. Coaches said that his posture was visibly unfamiliar, upright, unbraced, weight distributed evenly rather than loaded into a stance. The student came in at a reduced pace, but with textbook form, shoulder down, driving through the contact point. Despite the instruction, he carried through the motion out of habit, the leading edge of his shoulder making concentrated contact directly over the left side of Marco's chest. He hit Marco slightly off-center on the upper chest. Marco's head snapped back on impact. His feet left the ground for a brief moment, a result of his unbraced posture and backward weight shift, before he landed flat on his back on the turf. Witnesses said that Marco attempted to push himself upright. He got part way, hands pressed to his chest, then stopped. Within seconds, he dropped sideways and did not move again. The live segment showed a teacher on the sideline moving first, reaching him before anyone else. The footage was immediately cut. His eyes were open and fixed. CPR began approximately 2 minutes after he went down. The school nurse called emergency services immediately, and no automated external defibrillator was available on the field at the time. An ambulance arrived 11 minutes later, but he was dead on arrival. The autopsy determined the cause of death to be sudden cardiac arrest, triggered by a blunt commotio cordis event, a disruption of heart rhythm caused by a strike to the chest at a precise, unlucky moment in the cardiac cycle, with the impact occurring over the precordial region in a narrowly focused contact point. No structural damage to the chest wall, no pre-existing condition identified. He was only 35 years old. The impact itself was not severe by rugby standards. The timing was. Although you could argue that Marco overlooked some preparation standards, I think this was a freak accident in the truest sense. Just an intersection of timing and circumstance that no one in that field could have predicted. What a way to start, huh? Now our next story killed a man because everyone in that room thought was busy laughing. It was March 9th, 2016, in Manchester, England. In a studio, a host whose signature was unsettling silence, a crowd primed to laugh at anything unexpected, and a catastrophic event already building behind his eyes. The only thing missing was anyone paying attention to the right thing at the right time. Elliot Safdie was 38 years old and had spent most of his adult life in small comedy clubs before graduating to panel television work as a live host. He was known for deadpan delivery and deliberate, extended silences, pauses so long and controlled that audiences never quite knew when the joke had ended. It was a specific skill, and it had built him a specific reputation. The man who could turn something uncomfortable into something hilarious. Earlier that evening, before taping began in a studio, Elliot apparently had mentioned a mild headache to a production assistant backstage. One of the crew said that he dismissed it himself, attributing it to the studio lighting. He had been performing live for roughly 22 minutes when it happened. A floor manager reviewing footage later told investigators that Elliot's pacing had shifted slightly in the final few minutes. His timing was still sharp, but his body had gone unusually still. Mid-sentence, Elliot stopped. He looked downward. As a comedy fan myself, I wouldn't blame what others did next. The audience read it immediately as a setup. The silence was familiar, and the laughter that rippled through the room was anticipatory, not concerned. He swayed once, caught himself with his left hand on the desk edge, and straightened. A camera operator, following instinct, pushed in for a close-up. What the footage captured was a man trying to find words that were no longer where he had left them. He attempted to resume. One word came out slurred, not garbled enough to be immediately alarming to a crowd primed to interpret everything as performance. He smiled faintly. The laughter grew louder. His right arm dropped to his side with no resistance, no recovery. The co-host, seated 2 chairs away later, told investigators she noticed the arm and felt something shift in her chest, but she did not move immediately. I don't fault her for that. The context of that room made hesitation almost inevitable. He did not fall. He slid, slowly, without bracing, off the side of his chair and onto the studio floor. The audience applauded. Several people in the front row later said they were clapping before they had consciously decided to. For 38 seconds after he was on the floor, no one intervened. The co-host approached, still half smiling, then crouched and placed a hand on his shoulder. He did not respond. His breathing, picked up faintly on the nearest desk microphone, was shallow and irregular, with a faint wet sound underneath it consistent with impaired airway control or possible aspiration that the audience could not hear, but the audio technician in the booth could. The floor manager called emergency services. A crew member nearby checked for responsiveness and repositioned him slightly onto his side while waiting. Paramedics arrived 9 minutes later. The attending physician's findings indicated a massive hemorrhagic stroke, a rupture of a blood vessel within the brain resulting in rapid neurological collapse, loss of motor function on the right side, and impaired speech. By the time of collapse, the hemorrhage would likely have already caused severe and irreversible damage. Death occurred several hours later at a nearby hospital despite supportive medical care. Elliot's greatest professional asset, his ability to make silence feel intentional, became the reason a room full of people watched him die and called it a punchline. Every skill he had built worked against him in those final minutes. It's sort of sad and noble to think that he made people laugh at the worst possible moment, but Elliot at least went out in a room full of laughter, surrounded by people who, even if they didn't realize it in time, were genuinely there for him. This next one, the guy was just doing his job in the middle of a street party, and the night had other plans entirely. It was June 18, 2015, in Salvador, Bahia, Brazil, on a night when the festival district had been running loud for hours, loud enough to bury any sound that didn't belong. The festival had drawn tens of thousands into the downtown corridor. TV host Renato Alves arrived with a cameraman and sound technician and set up near the main stage. There was a visible multi-layered security presence, including municipal police units, private security fencing, and roaming patrols along the main corridor, though coverage thinned noticeably in the inner crowd pockets. At 44, he had covered carnivals and outdoor concerts across 20 years without serious incident. This night was supposed to be another one of those. However, an altercation had broken out 2 blocks away about an hour before his scheduled live cross, shoving, raised voices. His crew noted it and still kept working. I think any experienced journalist in that environment makes the same call. It reads like noise, and if it's something serious, drama is always good for live TV. The heat hadn't broken. Stage lights washed everything orange. Renato worked the outer crowd with a wireless microphone while his cameraman tracked from 15 feet away. By 10:40 p.m., he was positioned at the stage left barrier, crowd packed 200 feet deep behind him, no sightline to the streets beyond. What his crew didn't know, the altercation hadn't dissolved. 2 rival factions had been pressing against each other in the northeast corridor, compressed by the crowd, drifting steadily toward the stage area all evening. They were filming live, and he was mid-sentence when the first sounds reached the audio feed. Flat, irregular pops from the northeast. The crowd didn't react. The cameraman later told investigators the sounds registered as firecrackers, which I probably would think too, given the event. The second burst came 8 seconds later, sharper, multiple rounds in quick succession. This time, several nearby attendees immediately recoiled and began moving en masse, creating a sudden wave of lateral panic through the foreground of the frame. People near the street broke toward the stage. The footage, as seen by multiple people in their houses, lurched. Renato turned toward the commotion, and in the lower left corner of the frame, his torso snapped backward as a round of bullets struck his upper chest. He staggered 2 steps right. He went down on his back. The live footage, partially obscured by a fleeing bystander and heavily shaking from the operator's movement, captured his hand still loosely holding the microphone, and a dark stain spreading from his shirt onto the pavement beneath him in fragmented, partially obstructed frames before being cut off. A man grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled him roughly 3 feet toward the stage barrier before stopping. Police and paramedics arrived 14 minutes later, forced on foot through crowd congestion from a staging point 1 block east. Renato was declared dead at 11:09 p.m. He lost consciousness within seconds of being struck, with fatal blood loss occurring rapidly, well before emergency responders reached the barrier. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be a single penetrating gunshot wound to the upper left chest, perforating the left lung and aortic arch, resulting in near-immediate internal hemorrhage and circulatory collapse within less than 1 minute. No exit wound was identified. Investigators confirmed the gunfire originated from a territorial dispute between rival street factions operating within the festival perimeter. Investigators confirmed the gunfire stemmed from a turf war between rival factions. Yet Brazil's authorities have done little more than shrug. It sucks to know, gang violence has become so normalized in Brazilian public spaces that another journalist's death barely registers as a headline anymore. Now, unlike Renato, this guy walked into the risk himself, knew it was there, and convinced himself it wouldn't matter. October 2nd, 2017. Kenji Tanaka had already spent his career making complex machinery understandable, but he never fully accounted for the one variable that would undo him: the gap between what was permitted and what was truly safe. Kenji was 46, a segment host for a mid-tier engineering television program that had carved out a modest but loyal audience across Japan and parts of Southeast Asia. He had spent his earlier career in industrial maintenance, conveyor systems, hydraulic presses, factory floor equipment, and that background gave him something most television personalities lacked. He actually understood what he was looking at. His goal for this live episode that day was to demystify high-speed rail wheel assemblies for a general audience, something he believed people had a right to understand. That instinct was not the problem. For the facility in Osaka, Japan, the access granted to the crew was limited, and the safety briefing conducted by facility staff that morning was compressed. A walkthrough rather than a formal protocol review. Standard lockout procedures, which would have physically prevented any train movement during filming, were partially suspended under a controlled demonstration authorization that allowed a single supervised train movement through the bay. A supervisor later told investigators the crew had been informed that a single train set would conduct a slow, controlled pass, estimated at under 10 miles per hour through the bay at the end of the segment. Kenji descended into the recessed service pit between the rails to frame the wheel bogie from below. Before filming began, he addressed the camera directly, telling viewers the position was considered safe only within marked clearance limits, under controlled conditions. That statement was not reviewed or challenged by anyone present. What Kenji likely understood, and what I think he underweighted, was that a controlled environment inside an active rail facility is still an active rail facility. His professional instinct to make the demonstration visually compelling pulled him to a position that had almost no margin for error. The bay itself was dim at ground level, lit by overhead fluorescents that threw flat light across the concrete. The pit walls were close, roughly 2 to 3 feet of clearance on either side when standing centered. The camera operator had positioned above the pit at floor level, angling the lens downward at Kenji from the front. At the far end of the bay, the train set began its approach. Crew members standing above the pit later told investigators they noticed the train moving at a pace that felt inconsistent with what they had been told to expect. A miscommunication between the control room and the floor operator had resulted in the train set entering the bay at a speed above the agreed demonstration threshold. A verbal stop command was issued over radio, but the distance and response time were insufficient to halt the train before it reached the pit. The microphones picked up the rising rail vibration and wheel noise first, a low, building mechanical rumble that carried through the structure several seconds before the train came into view. The camera operator described feeling it through the floor before he saw anything. The feed was already live, and Kenji was mid-sentence, pointing left toward a specific component on the bogie housing. That lean was slight. Investigators estimated no more than a few inches of lateral movement from his centered position. It was enough. The lower lateral structure of the passing bogie assembly made contact at his brow line. The sound captured on audio was a single sharp metallic impact, not prolonged. His body dropped immediately into the pit, partially outside the camera frame. The operator recoiled and immediately cut the live feed. Witnesses said that blood was visible on the concrete wall behind where Kenji had been standing. The train completed its pass before the emergency stop procedure brought it to a halt further down the bay. On-site medics reached the pit in 4 minutes. Kenji was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner documented blunt force cranial trauma at the frontal and parietal region, consistent with a high-velocity strike, with secondary cervical fracture and immediate fatal brain injury. The miscommunication between operators was real, and it was serious. But I keep returning to the same point. The pit, centered or not, was never a position with acceptable margin. Kenji didn't have to be there to tell that story. He could have stood above it. He chose the angle that made better television, and that choice existed before the train ever moved. And if you think this compilation couldn't get any worse, this next story has so many people failing at the same time that it almost doesn't feel real. It was January 12, 2013 in Limpopo, and on a morning that held no scream, no growl, no warning at all, Daniela Moraes was about to meet her maker. Daniela was 39, a live field host for a regional wildlife awareness program with nearly a decade of on-location segments across southern Africa. She had no formal zoology training, but years in the field had made her comfortable near enclosures in a way that likely stopped registering as a liability. She was composed on camera, knowledgeable enough to sound authoritative, and driven enough to push for a better shot when a segment needed it. The trip to Limpopo was meant to produce a short piece on predator behavior, how large cats respond when a human presence is ignored rather than engaged. Now apparently, the facility was aging and non-compliant with modern safety standards. The male lion's steel enclosure had bar spacing of approximately 3 inches, designed in a way that still allowed partial forelimb extension through the gaps under certain angles. A staff member briefed the crew before filming, specifying a minimum 3-foot distance from the bars at all times. Daniela acknowledged it in front of the crew. There was nothing to suggest she hadn't understood. She moved closer anyway, and the way I read it was she did it not recklessly, but incrementally, the way people do when a shot demands it and the margin feels theoretical. She turned her back partially toward the enclosure to address the camera, standing roughly 2.5 feet from the bars. In the live feed, audiences throughout South Africa could see the lion had been pacing, steady, looping movement the crew had watched for several minutes without visible concern. Nothing in its behavior read as escalating. The live segment appeared to be going well. The morning light was flat and even. The animal gave no vocalization and showed no change in movement that anyone registered in time. The camera operator later told investigators the motion happened faster than his eyes could parse. The lion at the interior wall, then the forelimb through the gap, fully extended, claws spread. The paw hooked into the right side of Daniela's neck and upper shoulder. Contact lasted under 2 seconds. She pulled free and staggered several feet backward before losing balance, covering approximately a few feet before her legs gave out. She went down on her side, one hand pressed against her neck. Blood was visible immediately, saturating her collar, spreading down her shirt before anyone reached her. The live feed was cut. Witnesses said that she did not speak. A crew member applied direct pressure while another ran for the facility handler. The crew loaded Daniela into a transport vehicle and drove toward the nearest road, where an ambulance intercepted them approximately 12 minutes later. She was pronounced dead before reaching the hospital. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be exsanguination from deep lacerations to the right lateral neck, including severing of the external jugular vein and partial disruption of the surrounding musculature. Now ask yourself this: how many separate failures had to occur for Daniela to end up so close to those bars? Let's list that, shall we? 1. The facility accepted a production crew into a non-compliant and outdated enclosure system. Staff issued a safety distance that went unenforced once cameras rolled. 2. The production team allowed an unqualified host to stand with her back to a large predator for a tighter camera angle. I think every one of those decisions belonged to someone else, and none of them paid the price she did. Sure, the third one might be that Daniela made a bad call, but she made it inside a system that had already stopped protecting her. If everything was wrong from the start in the previous stories, this next victim at the center of it did absolutely everything right. It was April 27, 2018. In Palawan, Philippines, a speedboat circling too close to a host filming a live segment, and the man surfacing for his final line to camera was utterly unaware that his last words are already being recorded. Luis Araneta was 35 years old and worked as a live host for a regional travel production company based in Manila, Philippines. Now, based on what I've looked up on him, specifically a feature interview on him, he had spent 6 years building a reputation for segments that prioritized authenticity. He didn't perform excitement, he actually felt it, and audiences could tell the difference. He was a competent open water swimmer, comfortable in moderate sea conditions, but held no formal certification in marine safety. He had arrived in El Nido 3 days earlier to film live water activities. The snorkeling segment was one of those. The support boat anchored in a designated snorkeling corridor, roughly 300 yards from the nearest shoreline. Luis had reviewed the shot sequence with the camera operator that morning. A floating introduction, a submerged reef pass, a surface close with direct address to camera. The zone had moderate tourist boat traffic, standard for the area on a weekend, and a channel marker buoy sat visible to the northeast. What no one on the crew addressed before entering the water was the speedboat that had been making wide loops near the corridor for at least 20 minutes before filming began, which had already been noted by 2 nearby tour boats over VHF as operating unusually close to a marked snorkeling lane, but was not formally challenged by any authority at the time. The live segment had been running approximately 11 minutes when Luis surfaced for the final address. He pushed his mask to his forehead, turned toward the camera mounted on the support boat's rail, and began speaking. The camera operator was adjusting the frame slightly, tightening the shot. The 2 crew members on deck were watching the monitor rather than the water, while the assigned safety lookout briefly shifted attention to the audio cue from the director. Engine noise had been audible in the ambient track for roughly 40 seconds before impact, increasing steadily in pitch and volume. A nearby tour vessel had also sounded a short warning horn earlier, but it was not clearly directed or repeated, and no immediate course correction followed from the approaching craft. None of the 3 looked up in time. The speedboat entered the frame from the right at an estimated 30 miles per hour. Luis turned his head in the final 2 seconds, the motion captured clearly on the live feed. He did not have time to dive, to raise an arm, or to move laterally. The hull struck him across the upper chest and left shoulder. The force drove him beneath the surface immediately. The live footage lost visual contact as the displaced water rolled into the shot and the boat rocked hard on the wake. He resurfaced approximately 8 seconds later, face down, motionless, carried several feet by the residual current before sinking again. The crew was shouting. One member pointed, another was already over the rail. The speedboat had continued approximately 30 yards before decelerating. The crew member who entered the water reached Luis within seconds and brought him to the surface with visible trauma across the torso and left side. Luis was transported to a coastal clinic where he was declared dead. The coroner noted blunt force trauma to the chest, consistent with high-speed vessel impact, including multiple rib fractures, pulmonary contusion, and internal hemorrhaging. The operator of the speedboat was detained at the scene, and investigators later confirmed he had been drinking and was already known for prior safety violations that were never properly enforced. He faced charges consistent with reckless imprudence resulting in homicide, aggravated by intoxication at the time of operation. It's harrowing to imagine that someone else's recklessness ended a life, a man who is careful and did everything right. That could have been me, that could have been you, and no extra careful steps could fix that. But sometimes nobody is drunk, just wrong. This next man trusted the math, and the math lied. It was September 5th, 2013, in Yekaterinburg, Russia, and the old grain silo stood isolated against a gray industrial skyline, surrounded by caution tape, camera crews, and a demolition perimeter that everyone on site believed would be far enough. For a few seconds after the charges went off, it even looked that way. Oleg Sidorov was 49 years old and had spent nearly 2 decades hosting a live regional industrial history program based out of Sverdlovsk Oblast. He was not a thrill seeker. He was methodical, well-regarded in local media circles, and genuinely interested in infrastructure. The kind of journalist who read demolition permits for context rather than spectacle. He had covered controlled demolitions before, several times, and I think that familiarity was, in hindsight, exactly the problem. The site that morning was a 7-story grain silo constructed in the late 1950s. The demolition crew had planted charges the previous day and established a marked safety perimeter roughly 1,000 feet from the base. Oleg had positioned himself outside the exclusion zone at a designated media staging point under supervision of a site safety officer and demolition liaison. No one allowed him near the crew line, and the idea of him standing close to the structure had already been explicitly denied. He had covered similar events before, and this arrangement was considered standard for active implosions on reinforced Soviet-era structures. The wind that morning shifted twice in the hour before detonation. Variable, but within what the crew considered acceptable range. No one called a hold. The countdown was broadcast live across 3 camera feeds, one fixed wide on the structure, one handheld near the crew line, and one general broadcast camera covering media and safety personnel rather than any single individual. At 10:14 a.m., the charges fired in sequence from the base upward. The structure folded inward on its lower axis exactly as modeled. The upper floors compressed and dropped. For roughly 2 seconds, everything looked controlled. Then a second crack, distinctly louder than the detonation sequence, came from somewhere inside the collapsing body of the silo. Several crew members later described it as a sound like a rifle shot amplified through a metal drum. One described instinctively turning away from it. Based on later investigations, the undocumented partition wall had failed asymmetrically under load, contributing to localized spalling and irregular lateral debris ejection. The collapse remained broadly controlled, but debris behavior became less predictable along one side of the structure. The live broadcast cameras did not isolate any single person in the impact zone, and visibility briefly degraded as dust and concrete fragments expanded outward. However, a concrete fragment, later estimated at roughly 40 pounds, was not cleanly tracked on any camera feed due to dust obscuration and frame obstruction at the moment of failure. What we just know from the aftermath was that it struck Oleg in the abdomen after crossing the exclusion boundary. which investigators later attributed to a combination of unexpected fragmentation and a brief procedural gap during post-blast verification of debris spread. He was knocked straight backward onto the ground. The operator later told investigators he heard the impact before he saw its source, a flat, dense sound, not like anything he associated with falling debris. 2 crew members and a site safety officer reached Oleg within seconds and cut the live feed. The safety officer immediately ordered all media personnel to maintain distance and initiated a halt on recording instructions. Blood spread across the front of Oleg's jacket rapidly. He was breathing fast and uneven and remained conscious for a short period. The site medic applied direct pressure. Oleg was transported to a regional hospital and taken into surgery, where he died several hours later. The coroner listed the cause of death as blunt abdominal trauma with rupture of the small intestine and mesenteric vasculature, leading to hemorrhagic shock and multi-organ failure. The engineering team faced administrative sanctions. Oleg's program ran a tribute episode several weeks later. But tribute episodes don't bring anyone back, and frankly, calling a perimeter safe doesn't make it so, especially when engineers cut corners on Soviet-era unknowns. Oleg paid for their laziness with his gut, and that's not a legacy. It's a preventable failure dressed up as a freak accident.